China has issued its strongest condemnation yet of American military action abroad, calling the United States' capture of Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro deeply shocking and a flagrant violation of international law. The timing is remarkable. Just hours before U.S. Special Forces stormed the presidential palace in Caracas early Saturday morning, Maduro had been meeting with China's special envoy to Latin America, reaffirming what both nations call their all-weather strategic partnership. Let's begin with what happened. In the early hours of Saturday, January 3rd, President Donald Trump announced that U.S. forces had carried out what he described as a large-scale strike against Venezuela. The operation targeted military installations across at least 4 Venezuelan states, including the capital Caracas. Within hours, Maduro and his wife Celia Flores were in U.S. custody, transported first to the USS Iwo Jima and then flown to New York, where Maduro is expected to face arraignment Monday on drug trafficking charges that were first filed back in 2020. The reaction from Beijing was swift and severe. China's foreign ministry released a statement late Saturday calling the American action hegemonic and a serious threat to peace and security throughout Latin America and the Caribbean region. The ministry spokesperson declared, quote, "China is deeply shocked and strongly condemns the U.S.'s blatant use of force against a sovereign state and action against its president. Such hegemonic acts seriously violate international law and Venezuela's sovereignty." But Beijing's statement went further, directly calling on Washington to ensure Maduro's personal safety, release him immediately, and stop what China termed attempts to subvert the Venezuelan regime. This isn't just diplomatic rhetoric. For China, the fall of Maduro represents the potential collapse of billions of dollars in investments and the loss of a critical ally in what Beijing sees as America's backyard. To understand why China is reacting so forcefully, we need to look at the deep economic and strategic ties binding these two nations together. Venezuela and China have been partners since 1974, but it was under the late Hugo Chavez, beginning in 1999, that the relationship transformed into something far more substantial. Chavez saw in China an alternative to American dominance. During his presidency, he visited China more than any other Latin American leader of his era. He even proclaimed that Simón Bolívar, Venezuela's independence hero, was a soulmate of Chairman Mao Zedong. The relationship was built on a simple but powerful foundation: oil for loans. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, even larger than Saudi Arabia's. China, the world's largest oil importer, needed secure energy supplies to fuel its economic miracle. The two countries established the China-Venezuela Joint Fund in 2007, with billions flowing from Beijing to Caracas. According to available estimates, China has lent upwards of $60 billion to Venezuela through state-run banks, making Beijing by far Venezuela's largest bilateral creditor. In exchange, Venezuela committed to shipping hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil daily to Chinese refineries. At its peak, bilateral trade between the two nations reached $20 billion annually. China became Venezuela's fourth largest oil supplier and a lifeline as American sanctions tightened. But here's where the story becomes more complicated. Venezuela's economy collapsed. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and falling oil prices devastated the country. Oil production plummeted. By 2018, Venezuela was exporting just over 380,000 barrels per day to China, far below the promised levels. Much of that oil was simply going to service Venezuela's massive debt to Beijing rather than generating new revenue. China found itself in what analysts call a creditor trap. It had lent so much money that it couldn't afford to let Venezuela fail entirely, yet it also couldn't justify throwing good money after bad. For the past several years, Chinese lending to Venezuela has been what economists describe as defensive, providing just enough support to protect Beijing's existing investments rather than funding new projects. Despite these economic troubles, the relationship remained strategically vital for both sides. For Venezuela under Maduro, China provided diplomatic cover at the United Nations, where Beijing's veto power on the Security Council offered protection against international intervention. China also became a crucial supplier of telecommunications equipment, infrastructure, and even military hardware. According to reports, China has sold over $600 million in weapons to Venezuela over the past decade. For China, Venezuela represented something equally important: a foothold in the Western Hemisphere and a partner in building what both nations call a multipolar world order, one where American power is balanced by other centers of influence. Which brings us to Friday, just hours before the American strike. Venezuela's state media released images of President Maduro warmly greeting Chu Xiaoqi, China's special representative for Latin American affairs, at the Miraflores presidential palace. The two men posed for photos. Maduro spoke of strengthening bilateral ties and building, in his words, a multipolar world of development and peace. Chu reiterated that China and Venezuela are long-standing strategic partners. It was a routine diplomatic engagement on the surface, but in hindsight, it takes on an almost tragic quality. We don't know if Chu was still in Caracas when American forces struck. The Chinese Foreign Ministry advised its citizens to avoid traveling to Venezuela and has not confirmed the whereabouts of its diplomatic delegation. What we do know is that for Beijing, this represents a stunning reversal. Just as China was publicly reaffirming its support for Maduro, American military power rendered that support meaningless. The images are stark. Maduro, blindfolded and wearing a sweatsuit, aboard an American warship. Videos of smoke rising over Caracas. The sound of explosions in the Venezuelan capital. President Trump, when asked about the Chinese meeting with Maduro just before the operation, dismissed any concerns. He said he has a very good relationship with President Xi Jinping and there won't be any problems, but that confidence may be premature. China's response suggests this incident cuts to the heart of Beijing's worldview and its strategic anxieties. Chinese state media and official statements are framing the American action not just as an attack on Venezuela, but as a broader assault on the principle of sovereignty itself. The subtext is clear. If the United States can unilaterally strike a sovereign nation, capture its leader, and fly him to New York to face trial, then no country aligned against Washington is truly safe. Some analysts in Taiwan have expressed alarm at what they see as a dangerous precedent. If America can conduct a decapitation strike against a government it opposes in Venezuela, what's to stop a similar operation elsewhere? Chinese foreign ministry statements have pointedly emphasized that such hegemonic behavior threatens peace and security not just in Latin America, but potentially everywhere. The economic implications for China are also severe. Chinese refiners, particularly the independent processors known as teapots, have been major buyers of Venezuelan crude. The heavy oil from Venezuela's Orinoco Basin, sold at steep discounts, has been attractive for making bitumen and other products. While official Chinese imports from Venezuela ceased in March of last year, shipping data indicates that oil continued flowing through complex ship-to-ship transfers designed to mask the cargo's origin. Close to half the tankers storing Venezuelan oil have been sitting in waters off China and Southeast Asia. With Maduro gone and a U.S.-backed transition potentially underway, China faces the prospect of losing both its oil supplies and any hope of recovering the tens of billions it has lent to Caracas over the years. A new Venezuelan government friendly to Washington would almost certainly prioritize American companies and American markets, not Chinese ones. China is not alone in condemning the American action. Russia, Cuba, Nicaragua, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia have all issued statements ranging from concern to outrage. France and several European nations have questioned the operation's legality while stopping short of full condemnation. The United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called the strikes a dangerous precedent and emphasized the importance of respecting international law and the UN Charter. Notably, only a handful of nations have openly supported the operation. Argentina's President Javier Milei, a staunch Trump ally, posted enthusiastically in support. Ukraine, citing Maduro's violations of human rights, also backed the move. But the international reaction has been largely critical or wary. An emergency session of the UN Security Council has been called for Monday. Russia and China are expected to demand explanations and potentially push for resolutions condemning the American action. The United States, with veto power of its own, can block any binding measures, but the political theater will be significant. For China, this moment represents both a setback and potentially an opportunity. Beijing is already positioning itself as the defender of international law and the champion of smaller nations against what it calls American hegemony. Chinese state media has published commentaries warning that when the law of the jungle replaces international norms, no sovereign nation is safe. This narrative plays well in many parts of the developing world, where memories of American interventions in Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere remain fresh. But there are limits to what China can do. Despite its rhetoric, Beijing has shown little appetite for direct military confrontation with the United States, especially in the Western Hemisphere, thousands of miles from Chinese shores. China's influence in Latin America, while growing, remains primarily economic rather than military, and that economic influence has been constrained by the Trump administration's aggressive campaign to pressure Latin American nations into limiting their ties with Beijing. Over the past year, several countries have yielded to U.S. pressure. Panama withdrew from China's Belt and Road Initiative. Mexico imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. The Trump administration, led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, an outspoken critic of Beijing, has made countering Chinese influence in Latin America a top priority. The capture of Maduro sends a clear signal. America is willing to use military force to reassert what it sees as its sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, U.S. officials invoked the Monroe Doctrine, warning European powers to stay out of the Americas. Now that warning is being directed at China and Russia. What happens next remains uncertain. President Trump has said the United States will run Venezuela until a proper transition can be arranged, though he's offered few details about what that means. Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, who won the disputed presidential election last year, is positioning herself as a potential leader in a post-Maduro era. But Venezuela faces enormous challenges: a collapsed economy, widespread poverty, millions of refugees scattered across the hemisphere, and deep political divisions. For China, the question is whether to cut its losses or continue supporting what remains of the Maduro government in exile. Beijing has called for Maduro's release, but few expect that to happen. Chinese diplomats will likely use the UN Security Council to criticize American unilateralism, but beyond rhetoric, Beijing's options are limited. The broader implications of this crisis extend well beyond Venezuela. This is a test of the international order, of the rules-based system that has governed relations between nations since World War II. It's a confrontation between two very different visions of how the world should work. The American vision, articulated by Trump and his advisors, emphasizes American strength, the right to act unilaterally when American interests are threatened, and the restoration of American dominance in its own hemisphere. The Chinese vision emphasizes sovereignty, non-interference, and a multipolar world where no single power dictates terms to others. Both narratives have power, both appeal to different audiences, and both will compete for influence in the months and years ahead. As we close tonight, we're watching not just the fall of one government in one country, but a potentially pivotal moment in the great power competition that is defining our era. The capture of Nicolás Maduro may resolve one crisis, but it has ignited another, one with implications that stretch from Caracas to Beijing, from Washington to the United Nations, and across a world increasingly uncertain about the rules that govern it. We'll continue to follow this story as it develops. For now, China's message is clear. What happened in Venezuela is unacceptable, dangerous, and a threat to every nation that values its sovereignty. Whether that message resonates beyond Beijing remains to be seen.